Discourse on Colonialism by Aime Cesaire. A civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeoisie rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise. The problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem, that Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience, and that increasingly it takes refuge in hypocrisy, which is all the more odious because it's less and less likely to deceive. Europe is indefensible. Apparently that is what the American strategists are whispering to each other. That in itself is not serious. What is serious is that Europe is morally, spiritually indefensible. And today the indictment is brought against it not only by the European masses alone, but on a world scale, by tens and tens of millions of men who, from the depths of slavery, set themselves up as judges. The colonialists may kill in Indochina, torture in Madagascar, imprison in Black Africa, crack down in the West Indies. Henceforth, the colonized know that they have an advantage over them. They know that their temporary masters are lying, therefore that their masters are weak. And since I've been asked to speak about colonization and civilization, let us get straight to the principal lie that is the source of all the others: colonialization and civilization. In dealing with this subject, the commonest curse is to be the dupe in good faith of a collective hypocrisy that cleverly misrepresents problems, the better to legitimize the hateful solutions provided for them. In other words, the essential thing here is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is dangerously, and to answer clearly the innocent first question: what fundamentally is colonization? To agree on what it is not: neither evangelization, nor a philanthropic enterprise, nor a desire to push back the frontiers of ignorance, disease, and tyranny, nor a project undertaken for the greater glory of God, nor an attempt to extend the rule of law. To admit once and for all that without flinching at the consequences that the decisive actors here are the adventurer and the pirate, the wholesale grocer and the ship owner, the gold digger and the merchant, appetite and force, and behind them the baleful projected shadow of a form of civilization which at a certain point in its history finds itself obliged for internal reasons to extend to a world scale the competition of its antagonistic economies. Pursuing my analysis, I find that the hypocrisy is of recent date, that neither Cortez discovering Mexico from the top of the great Teocalli, nor Pizarro before Cuzco, much less Marco Polo before Cambaluc, claims that he is the harbinger of a superior order, that they kill, that they plunder, that they have helmet lance as cupidities, and the slavering apologists come later, that the chief culprit in this domain is Christian pedantry, which laid down the dishonest equations, that Christianity equals civilization and paganism equals savagery, from which there could be but ensue abominable colonists and racist consequences, whose victims were to be the Indians, the yellow peoples, and the Negroes. That being settled, I admit that it is a good thing to place different civilizations in contact with each other. That it is an excellent thing to blend different worlds, that whatever its own particular genius may be, a civilization that withdraws into itself atrophies, that for civilizations exchange is oxygen, that the great good fortune of Europe is to have been a crossroads, that because it was the locus of all ideas, the receptacle of all philosophies, the meeting place of all sentiments, it was the best center of the redistribution of energy. But then I ask the following question: has colonization really placed civilizations in contact? Or if you prefer, of all the ways of establishing contact, was it the best? I answer no. And I say that between colonization and civilization there is an infinite distance, that of all the colonial expeditions that have been undertaken, out of all the colonial statutes that have been drawn up, out of all the memoranda that have been dispatched by all the ministries, there could not have come a single human value. First, we must study how colonization works to de-civilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to grade him, to awaken him into buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism, and we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured and in France, they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight, a universal regression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread, and that at the end of all the treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners that have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison that has been distilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds towards savagery. And then, one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gespapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invest, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant, they say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it'll pass. And they wait and they hope and they hide the truths from themselves. That is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that is Nazism. Yes, but that was before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had only been applied to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. Yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeoisie of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside of him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that at bottom what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man, it is not the humiliation of man as such, but it is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the people of India, and the people of Africa. And that is the great thing I hold against pseudo-humanism, that for too long it has diminished the rights of man, that its concept of these rights has been and still is narrow and fragmentary, incomplete and biased, and in all things considered, sordidly racist. I've talked a good deal about Hitler, because he deserves it. He makes it possible to see things on a large scale and to grasp the fact that capitalist society at its present stage is incapable of establishing a concept of the rights of all men, just as it has proved incapable of establishing a system of individual ethics. Whether one likes it or not, at the end of the blind alley that is Europe, I mean the Europe of Adenauer, Schumann, Bedol, and a few others, there is Hitler. At the end of capitalism, which is eager to outlive its day, there is Hitler. At the end of formal humanism and philosophic renunciation, there is Hitler. And this being so, I cannot help thinking of one of his statements. We aspire not to equality, but to domination. The country of a foreign race must once again become a country of serfs, of agricultural laborers, or industrial workers. It is not a question of eliminating the inequalities among men, but of widening them and making them into law. That rings clear, haughty, and brutal, and plants us squarely in the middle of howling savagery. But let us come down a step. Who is speaking? I am ashamed to say it. It is the Western humanist, the idealist philosopher. That his name is Renan is an accident. That the passage is taken from a book entitled La Réforme intellectuelle et morale, that it was written in France just after a war which France had represented as a war of right against might, tells us a great deal of bourgeoisie morals. The regeneration of the inferior or degenerate races by the superior races is part of the providential order of things for humanity. With us, the common man is nearly always a declassed nobleman. His heavy hand is better suited to handling the sword than menial tool. Rather than work, he chooses to fight, that is, he returns to his first estate. Regere imperio populos, that is our vocation. Pour forth this all-consuming activity onto countries which, like China, are crying aloud for foreign conquest. Turn the adventurers who disturb European society into a versacrum, a horde like those of the Franks, the Lombards, or the Normans, and every man will be in his right role. Nature has made a race of workers. The Chinese race, who have wonderful manual dexterity and almost no sense of honor, govern them with justice, levying them from them in return for the blessing of such a government, an ample allowance for the conquering race, and they will be satisfied. A race of tillers of soil, the Negro. Treat him with kindness and humanity, and all will be as it should. A race of masters and soldiers, the European race. Reduce this noble race to working the ergastulum like Negroes and Chinese, and they rebel. In Europe, every rebel is more or less a soldier who has missed his calling, a creature made for the heroic life, before whom you are setting a task that is contrary to his race, a poor worker, too good a soldier. But the life at which our workers rebel would make a Chinese or a fellah happy, as they are not military creatures in the least. Let each one do what he is made for, and all will be well. But was this Hitler, Rosenberg? No, Renan. But let us come down one step further, and it is the long-winded politician who protests. No one, as far as I know, when M. Albert Sarratt, the former Governor-General of Indochina, holding forth to students at the École Coloniale, tells them that it would be a puerile to object to the European colonial enterprises in the name of an alleged right to possess the land one occupies, and some sort of right to remain in fierce isolation, which would leave unutilized resources to lie forever ideal in the hands of incompetence. And who is roused to indignation when a certain reverend bard assures us that if the goods of this world remained divided up indefinitely, as they would be without colonization, they would answer neither to the purposes of God nor just demands of the human collectively. Since it is his fellow Christian, the Reverend Muller declares, humanity cannot allow the incompetence, negligence, and laziness of the uncivilized peoples to leave ideal indefinitely the wealth which God has confided to them, charging them to make it serve the good of all. No one. I mean, not in one established writer, not one academic, not one preacher, not one crusader for the right for all religion, not one defender of the human person. And yet, through the mouths of Sarrats and bards, the Mullers and the Renans, through the mouths of all who consider it lawful applied to non-European peoples, a kind of expropriation for public purposes, for the benefit of nations that were stronger and better equipped, it was already Hitler speaking. What am I driving at? At this idea that no one colonizes innocently, that no one colonizes with impunity either, that a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies its colonialization and therefore force, is already a sick civilization. A civilization which is morally diseased, which irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler, I mean its punishment. Colonization, bridgeheaded in a campaign to civilize barbarism, from which they may emerge at any moment of the negation of civilization pure and simple. Elsewhere I have cited at length few incidents culled from the history of colonial expeditions. Unfortunately, this did not favor with everyone. It seems that I was pulling old skeletons out of a closet indeed. Was there no point in quoting Colonel de Montignac, one of the conquerors of Algeria? In order to banish the thought that sometimes besieged me, I have some heads cut off, not the heads of artichokes, but the heads of men. Would it have been more advisable to refuse the floor to Count de Harrison? It is true that we are bringing back a whole barrelful of ears collected, pair by pair, from prisoners, friendly or enemy. Should I have denied Saint Ardinaud the right to profess his barbarous faith? We lay waste, we burn, we plunder, we destroy the houses and trees. Should I have prevented Marshal de Bugeaud from systematizing that in a daring theory and provoking the precedent of famous ancestors? We must have a great invasion of Africa, like the invasions of the Franks and the Goths. Lastly, should I have cast back into the shadows of oblivion the memorable feat of arms of General Gerard, and kept silent about the capture of Ambique, a city which, to tell the truth, had never dreamed of defending itself? The native riflemen had orders to kill only the men, but no one restrained them. Intoxicated by the smell of blood, they spared not one woman, not one child. At the end of the afternoon, the heat caused a light mist to arise. It was the blood of 5,000 victims, the ghost of the city, evaporating into the setting sun. Yes or no, are these things true? And the sadistic pleasures, the nameless delights that send voluptuous shivers and quivers through Loti's carcass when he focuses his field glasses on a good massacre of the enemies, true or not true? And if these things are true, as no one can deny, will it be said in order to minimize them that these corpses don't prove anything? For my part, if I have recalled a few details of these hideous butcheries, it is by no means because I take a morbid delight in them, but because I think that these heads of men, these collections of ears, these burned houses, these Gothic invasions, these streaming bloods, these cities that evaporate at the edge of the sword, are not to be so easily disposed of. They prove that colonization, I repeat, dehumanizes even the most civilized man, that colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it, that the colonizer who, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. It is this result, this boomerang effect of colonization, that I wanted to point out. Unfair? No. There was a time when these same facts were a source of pride, and when, sure of the morrow, people did not mince words. One last quotation. It is from a certain Karl Siger, author of Essai sur la Colonialisation, Paris of 1907. The new countries offer a vast field for individual violent activities which in the metropolitan countries would run up against certain prejudices, against a sober and orderly conception of life, and which in the colonies have greater freedom to develop and consequently to affirm their worth. Thus, to a certain extent, the colonies can serve as a safety valve for modern society. Even if there were their only value, it would be immense. Truly there are sins which no one has the power to make amends, which can never be fully expiated. But let us speak about the colonized. I see clearly what colonization has destroyed. The wonderful Indian civilizations, and neither Detterding nor Royal Dutch nor Standard Oil will ever console me for the Aztecs and the Incas. I see clearly the civilizations condemned to perish at a future date, into what is introduced the principle of ruin. The South Sea Islands, Nigeria, Nyasaland. I see clearly the contributions it has made. Security, culture, the rule of law. In the meantime, I look around, and wherever there are colonizers and colonized face to face, I see force, brutality, cruelty, sadism, conflict, and in a parody of education, the hasty manufacture of a few thousand subordinate functionaries, boys, artisans, office clerks, and interpreters necessary for smooth operation of business. I spoke of contact. Between colonizer and colonized, there is only room for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinnishness, brainless elites, and degraded masses. No human contact, but relations of domination and submission, which turn the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. My turn to state an equation. Colonization equals thingification. I hear the storm, they talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. I am talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. They throw facts at my head, statistics, mileages of roads, canals, and railroad tracks. I am talking about the thousands of men sacrificed to the Congo Ocean. I am talking about those who, as I write this, are digging the harbor of the Abidjan by hand. I am talking about millions of men torn from their gods, their land, their habits, their life, from dance, from wisdom. I am talking about millions of men from whom fear has been cunningly instilled, who have been taught to have an inferiority complex, to tremble near despair and behave like flunkies. They dazzle me with the tonnage of cotton or cocoa that has been exported, the acreage of planted with olive trees or grapevines. I am talking about natural economies that have been disrupted, harmonious and viable economies adapted into indigenous populations, about food crops destroyed, malnutrition permanently introduced, agricultural development oriented solely towards the benefit of the metropolitan countries, about the looting of products, the looting of raw materials. They pride themselves on abusives eliminated. I too talk about abusives. But what I say is on the old ones, very real. They have superimposed others, very detestable. They talk to me about local tyrants brought to reason, but I note that in general the old tyrants get on very well with the new ones, and that there has been an established between them, to determine of the people, a circuit of mutual services and complicity. They talk to me about civilizations. I talk about proletarianization and mystification. For my part, I make a systematic defense of non-European civilizations. Every day that passes, every denial of justice, every beating by the police, every demand of the workers that is drowned in blood, every scandal that is hushed up, every punitive expedition, every police van, every gendarme, and every militiaman brings home to the value of our old societies. They were communal societies, never societies of the many for the few. They were societies that were not only anti-capitalist, as has been said, but also anti-capitalist. They were democratic societies always. They were cooperative societies, fraternal societies. I make a systematic defense of the societies destroyed by imperialism. They were the fact. They did not pretend to be the idea despite their faults. They were neither to be hated nor condemned. They were content to be. In them neither the word failure nor the word avatar had any meaning. They kept hope intact, whereas those are the only words that can in all honesty be applied to the European enterprises outside Europe. My only consolation is that periods of colonization pass, that nations sleep only for a time, and that peoples remain. This being said, it seems in a certain circle they pretend to have discovered me as an enemy of Europe and a prophet of the return to pre-European past. For my part, I search in vain for the place where I could have expressed such views, where I ever underestimated the importance of Europe in the history of human thought, where I ever preached any return of kind, where I ever claimed that there could be a return. The truth is, I have said something very different, to wit, that great historical tragedy of Africa has not been so much that it was too late in making contact with the rest of the world, as the manner in which that contact was brought about. Europe began to propagate at a time when it had fallen into the hands of the most unscrupulous financiers and the captains of industry, that it was our misfortune to encounter that particular Europe on our path, and that Europe is responsible before the human community for the highest heap of corpses in history. In another connection in judging colonization, I have added that Europe has gotten on very well indeed with all the local feudal lords who have agreed to serve, woven a villainous complicity with them, rendered their tyranny more effective and more efficient, and that it has actually tended to prolong artificially the survival of local pasts in the most pernicious aspects. I have said, and this is something very different, that colonialist Europe has grafted modern abuse onto ancient injustice, hateful racism onto old inequality. That if I am attacked on the grounds of intent, I maintain that colonialist Europe is dishonest in trying to justify its colonizing activity a posteriori by obvious material progress that have been achieved in certain fields under the colonial regime. Since sudden change is always possible in history as elsewhere, since no one knows what a stage of material development these same countries would have been if Europe had not intervened, since the introduction of technology into Africa and Asia, their administration reorganization, in a word, their Europeanization, was, as is proved by the example of Japan, in no way tied to the European occupation, since the Europeanization of the non-European continents could have been accomplished otherwise than under the heel of Europe. Since this is the movement of Europeanization was in progress, since it was even slowed down, since any caste it was distorted by the European takeover. The proof is that at present it is indigenous peoples of Africa and Asia who are demanding schools in colonialist Europe which refuses them. That it is the African who is asking for ports and roads, and the colonialist Europe which is redacted on this score, that it is the colonized man who wants to move forward and the colonizer who holds things back. To go further, I make no secret of my opinion that at present time the barbarism of Western Europe has reached an incredibly high level, being only surpassed, far surpassed, by the barbarism of the United States. And I am not talking about Hitler or the prison guard or the adventurer, but about the decent fellow across the way. Not about the member of the SS or the gangster, but about the respectable bourgeoisie. In a time gone by, Leon Bloy innocently became indignant over the fact that swindlers, perjurers, forgers, thieves, and procurers were given the responsibility of bringing the Indies the example of Christian virtues. We've made progress. Today it is the possessor of the Christian virtues who intrigues with no small success for the honor of administering overseas territories according to the methods of foragers and torturers. A sign that cruelty, mendicity, baseness, and corruption have sunk deep into the soul of the European bourgeoisie. I repeat that I am not talking about Hitler or the SS or pogroms or summary executions, but about a reaction caught unawares, a reflex permitted, a piece of cynicism tolerated. And if evidence is wanted, I could mention of seed a cannibalistic hysteria that I have been privileged to witness in the French National Assembly. By Jove, my dear colleagues, as they say, I take off my hat to you, a cannibal's hat, of course. Think of it, 90,000 dead in Madagascar, Indochina trampled underfoot, crushed to bits, assassinated, tortures brought back from the depths of the Middle Ages, and what a spectacle. The delicious shudder that roused the dozing deputies, the wild uproar, Biddledald looking like a communion wafer dipped in shit. Unctuous and sanctimonious cannibalism, Motet, the cannibalism of shady deals and sonorous nonsense, Costefloret, the cannibalism of an unlicked bear club, a blundering fool. Unforgettable gentlemen. With fine phrases as cold and solemn as a mummy's wrappings, they tie up the Madagascan. With a few conventional words, they stab him for you. The time it takes to wet your whistle, they'll disembowel him for you. Fine work, not a drop of blood will be wasted. The ones who drink it straight up, to the last drop. The ones like Ramadia, who smear their faces with it in the manner of silliness. Fontlep Esparaber, who starches his mustache with it, the walrus mustache of an ancient Gaul. Old Desjardins, bending over with the emanation of the vat, intoxicating himself with them as new wine. Violence, the violence of the weak, a significant thing. It is not the head of a civilization that begins to rot first. It is the heart. I admit that far of the health of Europe and civilization is concerned, these cries of kill, kill, and let's see some blood, belched forth by trembling old men and virtuous young men educated by the Jesuit fathers, make a much more disagreeable impression on me than the most sensational bank hold-ups that occur in Paris. And that, mind you, is by no means an exception. On the contrary, bourgeoisie swishness is the rule. We've been on its trail for a century. We listen for it, we take it by surprise, we sniff it out, we follow it, lose it, find it again, shadow it, and every day it is more nauseatingly exposed. Oh, the racism of these gentlemen do not bother me. I do not become indignant over it. I merely examine it. I note it, and that's all. I'm almost grateful for it expressing itself openly and appearing in broad daylight as a sign. A sign that the intrepid class which once stormed the Bastilles is now hamstrung. A sign that feels itself to be mortal. A sign that feels itself to be a corpse. And when the corpse starts to babble, you get this sort of thing. There was only too much truth in the first impulse of the Europeans, and the century of Columbus refused to recognize as their fellow men the degraded inhabitants of the New World. One cannot gaze upon the savage for an instant without reading the anathema written, I do not say upon his soul alone, but even on the external form of his body. And it's signed Joseph de Maistre. That's what is ground by the mystical mill. And then you get this. From the selectionist point of view, I would look upon it as the unfortunate if there should ever be a great numerical expansion of the yellow and black elements, which would be difficult to eliminate. However, if the society of the future is organized on the dualistic basis, with a ruling class of dolichocephalic blondes and a class of inferior race confined to the roughest labor, it is possible that this latter role would fall to the yellow and black elements. In this case, moreover, they would not be an inconvenience for the dolichocephalic blondes, but an advantage. It must not be forgotten that slavery is no more abnormal than the domestication of the horse or the ox. It is therefore possible that it may reappear in the future in one form or another. It is probably even inevitable that this will happen if the simplistic solution does not come about instead that of a single superior race leveled out by selection. That is what ground out by the scientific mill, and it's signed Lepage. And you also get this from the literary mill at this time. I know that I must believe myself superior to the poor bias of the Mambare. I know that I must take pride in my blood. When a superior man ceases to believe himself superior, he actually ceases to be superior. When a superior race ceases to believe itself a chosen race, it actually ceases to be a chosen race. And its sign, Pischardi, soldier of Africa. Translate it into newspaper jargon and you'd get Foguet. The barbarism is all of the same race, after all. As the Roman and the Greeks, he is a cousin. The yellow man, the black man, is not our cousin at all. Here there is a real difference, a real distance, and a very great one, an ethnological distance. After all, civilization has never yet been made except by whites. If Europe becomes yellow, there will be certainly a regression, a new period of darkness and confusion, that is, another Middle Ages. And then, lower, always lower to the bottom of the pit, lower than the shovel can go, M. Jules remains of the Académie Françoise and the Rêve de deux mondes. It doesn't matter, of course, that M. Farjolf changed his name once again and here calls himself Salset for the sake of convenience. The essential thing is that M. Jules remains goes as far as to write this. I am willing to carry on discussion only with people who agree to pose the following hypothesis. A France that has on its metropolitan soil 10 million blacks, 5 or 6 million of them in the valley of the Garonne. Would our valiant populations of the Southwest never have been touched by race prejudice? Would there not have been the slightest apprehension of the question had arisen of turning all powers over to the Negroes, the son of slaves? I once had opposite me a row of 20 pure blacks. I will not even censure our Negroes and Negresses for chewing gum. I will only note that this movement has the effect of emphasizing the jaws and that the associations which come to mind evoke the equatorial forest rather than the procession of the Panthenia. The black race has not yet produced, will never produce, an Einstein, a Stravinsky, a Gershwin. One idiotic comparison for another, since the prophet of the Revue des Deux Mondes and other places invite us to draw parallels between widely separated things, may I be permitted, Negro that I am, to think, no one being master of his free associations, that his voice has much less in common with the rustling of the oak of Dodona, or even the vibrations of the cauldron, than with the braying of a Missouri ass. Once again, I systematically defend our old Negro civilizations. They were courteous civilizations. So the real problem, you say, is to return to them. No, I repeat, we are not men for whom it is the question of either or. For us, the problem is not to make a utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past, but to go beyond. It is not a dead society that we want to revive. We leave that to those who go in for exoticism. Nor is it the present colonial society that we wish to prolong, the most putrid carrion that has ever rotted under the sun. It is a new society that we must create with the help of all of our brother slaves, a society rich with the productive power of modern times, warm with all the fraternity of olden days. Some examples showing us that this is possible, we can look to the Soviet Union. But let us return to M. Jules' remains. One cannot say that the petty bourgeoisie has never read anything. On the contrary, he has read everything, devoured everything. Only his brain functions after the fashion of certain elementary types of digestive systems. It filters, and the filter lets through only what can nourish the thick skin of the bourgeoisie's clear conscience. Before the arrival of the French in their country, the Vietnamese were people of an old culture, exquisite and refined. To recall this fact upsets the digestion of the Bank Indochine. Start the forgetting machine. These Madagascans who are being tortured today, less than a century ago were poets, artists, administrators. Shh, keep your lips buttoned, and silence falls, silence as deep as safe. Fortunately, there are still the Negroes. Ah, the Negroes. Let's talk about the Negroes. All right, let's talk about them. About the Sudanese empires, about the bronzes of Benin, the Shango sculpture. That's all right with me. It will give us a change of all the sensationally bad art that adorns so many European capitals. About African music, why not? And what about what the first explorers said, what they saw, not those who feed at the company managers, but the Deblis, the Martials, the Pigafettes, and the Forbenius. Say you know who he was, Forbenius, and we read together, civilized to the marrow of their bones. The idea of the barbaric Negro is a European invention. The petty bourgeoisie doesn't want to hear any more. With a twitch of his ears, he flicks the ideas away. The idea, an annoying fly. Therefore, comrade, you will hold as enemies, loftily, lucidly, consistently, not only sadistic governors and greedy bankers, not only prefects who torture and colonists who flog, not only corrupt check-licking politicians and subservient judges, but likewise, and for the same reason, venomous journalists, goturous academics, reached in dollars and stupidity, ethnographers who go in for metaphysics, presumptuous Belgian theologians, chattering intellectuals born stinking out of the thigh of Nietzsche, the paternalists and embracers, the corrupters and the backslappers, the lovers of exoticism, the dividers, the agrarian sociologists, the hoodwinkers, the hoaxers, the hot air artists, the humbags, and in general, all those who, performing their functions in the sordid division of labor for the defense of Western bourgeoisie society, try in diverse ways and by infamous diversions to split up the forces of progress, even if it means denying the very possibility of progress, all of them tools of capitalism, all of them openly or secretly supporters of plundering colonialism, all of them responsible, all hateful, all slave traders, all henceforth answerable for the violence of revolutionary action. And sweep out all the obscurers, all the inventors of subterfuges, all the charlatans, the tricksters, the dealers in gobbledygook, and do not seek to know whether personally these gentlemen are in good or bad faith, whether personally they have good or bad intentions, whether personally, that is, in the private conscience of Peter or Paul, they are or are not colonialists, because the essential thing is that their highly problematical subjective good faith is entirely irrelevant to the objective social implications of the evil work they perform as watchdogs of colonialism. In this connection, I cite as examples, purposely taken from very different disciplines. From Garot, his book Le Pays Tripicos, in which, amid certain correct observations, there is expressed the fundamental thesis, biased and unacceptable, that there has never been a great tropical civilization, that great civilizations have only existed in temperate climates, that in every tropical country the germ of the civilization comes and can only come from some other place outside the tropics, and if the tropical countries are not under the biological curse of the racists, there at least hangs over them with some consequences a no less effective geographical curse. From Reverend Temple's, a missionary in Belgium, his Bantu philosophy, as slimy and fetid as one could wish, but discovered very opportunely, as Hinduism was discovered by others in order to counteract the communistic materialism which it seems threatened to turn the Negroes into moral vagabonds. From the historians or novelists of civilizations, it is the same thing, not from this one or that one, but from all of them, or almost all, their false objectivity, their chauvinism, their sly racism, their deprived passion for refusing to acknowledge any merit in the non-white races, especially the black-skinned races, their obsession with monopolizing all glory for their own race. From the psychologists, sociologists, et al., their views on primitivism, their rigged investigations, their self-serving generalizations, their tendentious speculations, their insistence on the marginal, separate character of the non-whites, and although each of these gentlemen, in order to impugn on higher authority of the weakness of the primitive thought, claims that his own is based on the firmest rationalization, their barbaric repudiation for the sake of the cause of Discourse's statement, the Charter of Universalism, the reason is found whole and entire in each man, that whereas individuals of the same species are concerned, there may be degrees of reflect in their accidental qualities, but not in the respect of their forms or nature. But let us not go too quickly. It is worthwhile to follow a few of these gentlemen. I shall not dwell upon the case of the historians, neither the historians of colonization nor the Egyptologists. The case of the former is too obvious, and for the latter, the mechanism by which they delude their readers has been definitively taken apart by the Sheikh Anta Diop in his book Nations, Negress, et Culture. the most daring book written by a Negro, and one which without question will play an important part in the awakening of Africa. Let us rather go back, to M. Goro to be exact. Need I say that this is from a lofty height that the eminent scholar surveys the native populations, which have taken no part in the development of modern science? That it is not from the effort of these populations, from their liberating struggle, from their concrete fight for life, freedom, and culture, that he expects the salvation under tropical countries to come, but from the good colonizers, since the law states categorically it is cultural elements developed in non-tropical regions which are ensuring and will ensure the progress of the tropical regions towards a larger population and higher civilization. I've stated that M. Goro's book contains some correct observations. The tropical environment and the indigenous societies, he writes, drawing up the balance sheet on colonization, have suffered from the introduction of techniques that are ill adapted to them, from coveries, porter service, forced labor, slavery, from the transplanting of workers from one region to another, sudden changes in the biological environment, and special new conditions that are less favorable. A fine record, the look on the university rector's face, the look on the cabinet minister's face when he reads that. Oh, Goro has slipped his leash, now we're in for it. He's going to tell everything. He's beginning. The typical hot countries find themselves faced with the following dilemma: economic stagnation and protection of the natives, or temporary economic development and regression of the natives. Monsieur Goro, this is very serious. I'm giving you a solemn warning. In this game it is your career which is at stake. So our Goro chooses to back off and refrain from specifying that if the dilemma exists, it only exists within the framework of the existing regime. That is, if this paradox constitutes an iron law, it is only the iron law of the colonialist capitalism, therefore of a society that is not only perishable but already in the process of perishing. What impure and worldly geography! If there is anything better, it is the reverend temples. Let them plunder and torture in the Congo. Let the Belgian colonizer seize all the natural resources. Let him stamp out all freedom. Let him crush all pride. Let him go in peace. The Reverend Father Temples consents to all of that. But take care. You are going to the Congo? Respect. I do not say native property. The great Belgian companies might take that as a dig at them. I do not say the freedom of the natives. The Belgian colonists might think that was subversive talk. I do not say the Congolese nation. The Belgian government might take it much amiss. I say, you are going to the Congo? Respect the Bantu philosophy. It would really be outrageous, writes the Reverend Temples, if the white educator were to insist on destroying the black man's own particular human spirit, which is the only reality that prevents us from considering him as an inferior being. It would be a crime against humanity on the part of the colonizer to emancipate the primitive races from which is valid, from that which constitutes a kernel of truth in the traditional thought, etc. What generosity, Father, and what zeal! Now then, know that Bantu thought is essentially ontological, that Bantu ontology is based in the truly fundamental notions of a life force and a hierarchy of life forces, and that for the Bantu the ontological order which defines the world comes from God, and as the divine decree must be respected. Wonderful. Everybody gains. The big companies, the colonists, the government, everybody except the Bantu, naturally. Since Bantu thought is ontological, the Bantu only ask for the satisfaction of ontological nature. Decent wages, comfortable housing, food. These Bantu are pure spirits, I tell you. What they desire first of all and above all is not the improvement of their economic or material situation, but the white man's recognition of and respect for their dignity as men, their full human value. In short, as you tip your hat to the Bantu life force, you give a wink to the immortal Bantu soul. And that's all it costs you. You have to admit you're getting off cheap. As for the government, why should it complain? Since the Reverend Temples notes with obvious satisfaction, from their first contact with the white men, the Bantu considered us from the point of view that was possible to them, the point of view of their Bantu philosophy, and integrated us into their hierarchy of life forces at a very high level. In other words, arrange it to so the white man, and particularly the Belgian, and even more particularly Albert or Leopold, takes his place at the head of the hierarchy of Bantu life forces, and you have done the trick. You will have brought this into miracle to pass. The Bantu god will take responsibility for the Belgian colonialist order, and any Bantu who dares raise his hand against it will be guilty of sacrilege. As for M. M. Manoni, in a view of his book, his observations on the Madagascan soul, he deserves to be taken very seriously. Follow him step by step through ins and outs of his little conjuring tricks, and he will prove to you as clear as day that colonization is based on psychology, that there are in this world groups of men for unknown reasons suffer what must be called dependency complex, that these groups are psychologically made for dependence, and that they need dependence, that they crave it, ask for it, demand it. And that is the case with most of the colonized people, and with the Madagascans in particular. Away with racism, away with colonialism. They smack too much of barbarism. M. Manoni has something better, psychoanalyses. Embellished with extensionalism, it gives astonishing results. The most down-to-the-heel cliches are resold for you and made good as new. The most absurd prejudices are explained and justifies, and as if by magic the moon is turned into green cheese. But listen to him. It is the destiny of the Occidental to face the obligation laid down by the commandment, "Thou shalt leap thy father and thy mother." This obligation is incomprehensible to the Madagascan. At a given time in his development, every European discovers in himself the desire to break the bonds of dependency, to become the equal of his father. The Madagascan, never. He does not experience rivalry with the paternal authority, manly protest, or Adlerian inferiority. Ordeals throughout which the European must pass, and which are like civilized forms of the initiation rites by which one achieves manhood. Don't let the subtleties of vocabulary, the new terminology, frighten you. You know the old refrain. The Negroes are big children. They take it, they dress it up for you, tangle it up for you. The result is Manoni. Once again, be reassured. At the start of the journey, it may seem a bit difficult, but once you are there, you'll find all of your baggage again. Nothing will be missing, not even the famous white man's burden. Therefore, give ear. Throughout these ordeals, reserved for the Occidental, one triumphs over the infantile fear of abandonment and acquires freedom and autonomy, which are the most precious possessions and also the burdens of the Occidental. And the Madagascan, you ask? A lying race of bondsmen, Kipling would say. M. Manoni makes his diagnosis. The Madagascan does not even try to imagine such a situation of abandonment. He desires neither personal autonomy nor free responsibility. Come on, you know how it is. These Negroes can't even imagine what freedom is. They don't want it. They don't demand it. It is the white agitators who put that into their heads, and if you gave it to them, they wouldn't know what to do with it. If you point out to M. Manoni, and the Madagascans have nevertheless revolted several times since the French occupation and again in recently 1947, M. Manoni, faithful to his premises, will explain to you that it is purely neurotic behavior, a collective madness, a running amok, that moreover, in this case, it was not a question of the Madagascans setting out to conquer real objectives, but imaginary security, which obviously implies that the oppression of which they complain is an imaginary oppression. So clearly, so insanely imaginary, that one might even speak of monstrous ingratitude, according to the classic example of the Fijian who burns the drying shed of the captain who has cured him of his wounds. If you criticize the colonialism that drives the most peaceful populations to despair, M. Manoni will explain to you that, after all, the ones that are responsible are not the colonialist whites, but the colonized Madagascans. Damn it all, they took the whites for gods and expected of them everything one expects of divinity. If you think the treatment applied to the Madagascans' neurosis was a trifle rough, M. Manoni, who has an answer for everything, will prove to you that the famous brutalities people talk about have been greatly exaggerated, that it is all a neurotic fabrication, that the tortures were imaginary tortures applied by imaginary executioners. As for the French government, it showed itself singularly moderate, since it was content to arrest the Madagascan deputies when it should have sacrificed them, if had wanted to respect the laws of a healthy psychology. I am not exaggerating. It is M. Manoni speaking. Treading very classical paths, these Madagascans transformed their saints into martyrs, their saviors into scapegoats. They wanted to wash their imaginary sins in the blood of their own gods. They were prepared, even at this price, rather only at this price, to reserve their attitude once more. One feature of this dependent psychology would seem to be that, since no one can serve two masters, one of the two should be sacrificed to the other. The most agitated of the colonialists in Tananarive had a confused understanding of the essence of the psychology of sacrifice, and they demanded their victims. They besieged the High Commissioner's office, assuring him that if they were granted the blood of a few innocents, everyone would be satisfied. This attitude, graceful from a human point of view, was based on what was, on the whole, a fairly accurate perception of the emotional disturbances that the population of the High Plateau was going through. Obviously, it is only a step from this absolving in the bloodthirsty colonialists. M. Manani's psychology is disinterested as free as M. Garreau's geography or the Reverend Temple's missionary theology. And striking thing they all have in common is the persistent bourgeoisie's attempt to reduce the most human problems to comfortable hollow notions. The idea of the dependency complex in Manani's, the ontological idea in the Reverend Temples, and the idea of tropicality in Garreau. What has become of the Bank Indochine and all that, and the Bank de Madagascar, and the bullwhip, and the taxes, and the handfuls of rice to the Madagascan or the Nuhabique, and the martyrs and the innocent people murdered, and the blood-stained money piling up in your coffers, gentlemen? They have been evaporated, disappeared, intermingled, and become unrecognizable in the realm of pale rationalizations. But there is one unfortunate thing for these gentlemen. It is that their bourgeoisie masters are less and less responsive to a tricky argument and are condemned increasingly to turn away from them and applaud others who are less subtle and more brutal. That is precisely what gives M. Yves Florence a chance, and indeed here neatly arranged on the tray of a newspaper, Le Monde, are his little offers of service. No possible surprises, completely guaranteed with the proven efficacy, fully tested with the conclusive results. Here we have a form of racism, a French racism, still not very sturdy, it is true, but promising. Listen to the man himself. Our reader, a teacher who had the audacity to contradict the irascible M. Florent, contemplating two young half-breed girls, her pupils, a sense of pride at the feeling that there is a growing measure of integration with our French family. Would her response be the same as she saw in reverse, French being integrated into the black family, or into the yellow or red? It makes no difference. That is to say, becoming diluted and disappearing. It is clear that for M. Yves Florent, it is blood that makes France, and the foundations of the nation are biological. It is people, its genius, are made of thousand-year-old equilibrium, that at the same time vigorous and delicate, and certain alarming disturbances of this equilibrium coincide with the massive and often dangerous infusion of foreign blood, which has had to undergo over the last 30 years. In short, cross-breeding, that is the enemy. No more social crisis, no more economic crisis, all that is left are racial crises. Of course, humanism loses none of its prestige. We are in the Western world, but let us understand each other. It is not by losing itself in the human nature, which is blood and its spirit, that France will be universal. It's by remaining itself. That is what the French bourgeoisie has come to 5 years after the defeat of Hitler. And it is precisely in that its historic punishment lies, to be contemned returning to as though driven by a vice, to chew over Hitler's vomit. Because, after all, M. Yves Florent was still fussing over peasant novels, dramas of the land, and stories of the evil eye when with a far more evil eye than the rustic hero of some tale of witchcraft Hitler was announcing. The supreme goal of the people state is to preserve the original elements of which race, which by spreading the culture creates beauty and dignity of the superior humanity. M. Yves Florent is aware of this direct descent, and he is far from being embarrassed by it. Fine, that's his right. As it is not our right to be indignant about it, because after all we must resign ourselves to be inevitable and say to ourselves once and for all that the bourgeoisie is condemned to be every day more snarling and more openly ferocious, more shameless, more summarily barbarous, and then its impeccable law that every decadent class finds itself turned into a receptacle into which there flow all the dirty waters of history. That is a universal law that before it disappears, every class must first disgrace itself completely on all fronts, and that it is with their heads buried in the dunghill that dying societies utter their swan songs. The dossier is indeed very overwhelming. a beast that by elementary exercises vitality spills blood and sows death, you remember that historically it was in the form of the fierce archetype that the capitalist society first revealed itself to the best minds in consciousness. Since then, the animal has become anemic. It's losing its hair, its hide is no longer glossy, but the ferocity has remained, barely mixed with sadism. It is easy to blame it on Hitler, on Rosenberg, on Junger and others, on the SS. But what about this? Everything in this world reeks of crime. The newspaper, the wall, the contentance of man. Baudelaire said that before Hitler was even born, which proves that evil has a deeper source. And Idesor Duques Comte Le Tourment. In this connection, it is high time to dissipate the atmosphere of scandal that has been created around the chance de Moldor. Monstrosity, literary meteorite, delirium of a sick imagination. Come on now, how convenient it is. The truth is that the Le Tourment had to only look the Iron Man forged by capitalist society squarely in its eye to perceive the monster, the everyday monster, his hero. No one denies the veracity of Balzac, but wait a moment. Take Vautrin, and let him just be back from the tropics. Just give him the wings of the archangel and the shivers of malaria. Let him be accompanied through the streets of Paris by an escort of Uruguayan vampires and carnivorous ants, and you will have Maldoror. The setting is changed, but it is the same world, the same man, hard, inflexible, unscrupulous, fond, if ever man was, of the flesh of other men. To digress for a moment within my digression, I believe that the day will come when all of these elements gathered together, all of these sources analyzed, all the circumstances of the work elucidated, it will be possible to give the chance to Maldoror a materialistic and historical interpretation which will bring to light an altogether unrecognized aspect of these frenzies epic, its implacable denunciation of a very particular form of society, as it could not escape the sharpest eyes around the year 1865. Before that, of course, we would have to had the clear way of the occultist and metaphysical commentaries that obscure the path, to re-establish the importance of certain neglected stanzas, for example, the strangest passage of them all, the one concerning the mine of lice, in which we will consent to see nothing more or less than denunciation of the evil power of gold and then the hoarding up of money to restore to its place the admirable episode of the omnibus, and be willing to find it very simply what it is, to wit, the scarcely allegorical picture of a society in which the privileged, comfortably seated, refuse to move closer together as to make room for the new arrival. Just, being it said in passing, who welcomes the child who has been callously rejected, the people, represented here by the rag-picker, Baudelaire's rag-picker. Paying no heed to the spies of the copse, his thralls, he pours his heart on in stupendous schemes. He takes great oaths and dictates sublime laws, casts down the wicked, aids the victim's cause. Then it will be understood, will it not, that the enemy whom Le Tourment has made the enemy, the cannibalistic, brain-devouring creator, the sadist perched on the throne made of human excrement and gold, the hypocrite, the debauchee, the idler who eats the bread of others, and from time to time is found dead drunk as bedbug that has swallowed 3 barrels of blood during that night. It will be understood that it is not beyond the clouds that one must look for that creator, but that we are more likely to find him in Defoe's business directory and on some comfortable executive board. But let that be. The moralist who can do nothing about it, whether one likes it or not, the bourgeoisie, as a class, is condemned to take responsibility for all of the barbarism of history, the tortures of the Middle Ages and the Inquisition, warmongering and the appeal to raison d'etat, racism and slavery, in short, everything against which it protested in unforgettable terms at the time when, as the attacking class, it was the incarnation of human progress. The moralists can do nothing about it. There is a law of which progressive dehumanization in accordance which the henceforth on the agenda of the bourgeoisie there can be, nothing but violence, corruption, and barbarism. I almost forgot hatred, lying, conceit. I almost forgot M. Roger Colossus. Well then, M. Colossus, from whom time immemorial has been given the mission to teach a lax and slipshod age rigorous thought and dignified style. M. Colossus, therefore, has been moved to mighty wrath. Why? Because of the great betrayal of the Western ethnography, which has, with a deplorable deterioration of the sense of responsibility, has been using all of its ingenuity of late to cast doubt upon overall superiority of Western civilizations over the exotic civilizations. Now at last M. Colossus takes the field. Europe has this capacity for rising up as heroic saviors at the most critical moments. It is unpardonable on our part not to remember Aime Cesaire, who around 1927 embarked on a crusade for the defense of the West. We want to make sure that the better fate is in store for M. Colossus, who, in order to defend the same sacred cause, transformed his pen into a good Toledo dagger. What did Aime Cesaire say? He deplored the fact that the destiny of Western civilization, and indeed the destiny of man, were now threatened, that an attempt was being made on all sides to appeal to our anxieties, to challenge the claims made for our culture, to call into question the most essential part of what we possess, and he swore to make war upon these disastrous prophets. M. Colossus identifies the enemy no differently. It is those European intellectuals who for the last 50 years, because of the exceptionally sharp disappointment and bitterness, have relentlessly repudiated the various ideals of their culture, and who have, by doing so, especially in Europe, a tenacious malaise. It is this malaise, this anxiety, which M. Colossus, for his part, means to put an end to. Indeed, no personage since the Englishman of the Victorian age has ever surveyed history with consciousness more serene and less clouded with doubt. His doctrine, it has the virtue of simplicity. That the West invented science, that the West alone knows how to think, that the borders of the West where the world there begins, and the shadowy realm of primitive thinking, which dominated by the notion of participation, incapable of logic, is the very model of faulty thinking. At this point one gives a start. One reminds M. Colossus that the famous law of participation invented by Levi-Bruhl was repudiated by Levi-Bruhl himself, that in the evening of his life he proclaimed to the world that he had been wrong in trying to define a characteristic that was peculiar to the primitive mentality so far logic was concerned, that on the contrary he had become convinced that these minds do not differ from ours at all from the point of view of logic, therefore that they cannot tolerate a formal contradiction any more than we can, therefore that they reject as we do, by kind of mental reflex, that which is logically impossible. A waste of time. M. Colossus considers the rectification to be null and void. For M. Colossus, the true Levi-Bruhl can only be Levi-Bruhl, who says the primitive man talks raving nonsense. Of course, there remain a few small facts that resist this doctrine, to wit the invention of arithmetic and geometry by the Egyptians, to wit the discovery of astronomy by the Assyrians, to wit the birth of chemistry among the Arabs, to wit the appearance of rationalization in Islam at the time when Western thought had furiously pre-logical cast to it. But M. Colossus soon puts these imperative details in their place, since it is strict principle that a discovery which does not fit into a whole is precisely only a detail, that is, say, negligible nothing. As you can imagine, once off to a good start, M. Colossus doesn't stop halfway. Having annexed science, he is going to claim ethics, too. Just think of it. M. Colossus has never eaten anyone. M. Colossus has never dreamed of finishing off an invalid. It has never occurred to M. Colossus to shorten the days of his aged parents. Well, there you have it, the superiority of the West. The discipline of life which tries to ensure that the human person is sufficiently respected so that it is not considered normal to eliminate the old and the infirm. The conclusion is inescapable. Compared to the cannibals, the dismemberers, or the other lesser breeds, Europe and the West are an incarnation of respect for human dignity. But let us move on, and quickly lest our thoughts wander Algiers, Morocco, and other places where, as I write these very words, so many valiant sons of the West and the semi-darkness of dungeons are lavishing upon the inferior African brothers with such tireless attention those authentic marks of respect for human dignity which are called, in technical terms, electricity, the bathtub, and the bottleneck. Let us press on. M. Colossus has not yet reached the end of his list of outstanding achievements. After scientific superiority and the moral superiority comes religious superiority. Here M. Colossus is careful not to let himself be deceived by the empty prestige of the Orient, Asia mother of gods, perhaps. Anyway, Europe mistress of rights. And see how wonderful it is. On the one hand, outside of Europe, ceremonies of the voodoo type, with all of their ludicrous masquerade and their collective frenzy, their wild alcoholism, their crude exploitation of a naive fever, and on the other hand, in Europe, those authentic values which Chateaubriand was already celebrating in the Génie du Christianisme, the dogmas and mysteries of the Catholic religion, its liturgy, the symbolism of its sculptures, and the glory of plain song. Lastly, a final cause for satisfaction. Gobineau said, "The only history is white." M. Colossus in turn observes, "The only ethnography is white." It is in the West that studies the ethnography of the others, not the others who study the ethnography of the West. A cause for greatest jubilation, is it not? And the museums of which M. Colossus is so proud, not for only 1 minute, does it cross his mind that, all things considered, it would have been better not to have needed them, that Europe would have done better to tolerate the non-European civilizations at its side, leaving them alive, dynamic, and prosperous, whole, not mutilated, that it would have been better to let them develop and fulfill themselves than to present for our admiration, duly labeled, their dead and scattered parts. That anyway, the museum by itself is nothing, that it means nothing, that it can say nothing when smug satisfaction rots the eyes, when a secret contempt for others withers the heart, when racism, admitted or not, drives up sympathy, that it means nothing, if its only purpose is to feed the delights of vanity. That after all, the honesty of contemporary of St. Louis, who fought Islam but respected it, had a better chance of knowing it than do our contemporaries, even if they have a smattering of ethnographic literature, who despise it. Know in the scales of knowledge, all museums in the world will never weigh so much as one spark of human sympathy. And what is the conclusion of all that? Let us be fair, M. Colossus is a moderate. Having established the superiority of the West in all fields, and having thus re-established a wholesome and extremely valuable hierarchy, M. Colossus gives immediate proof of this superiority by concluding that no one should be exterminated. With him, the Negroes are sure that they will not be lynched. The Jews will not be fed into new bonfires. There is one new thing. It is important for us to clearly understand that Negroes, Jews, and Australians owe this tolerance not to their respective merits, but to the magnanimity of M. Colossus, not to the dictates of science, but they can only offer ephemeral truths, but to a degree of M. Colossus's conscience, which can be only absolute, that this tolerance has no conditions, no guarantees, unless it be M. Colossus's sense of his duty to himself. Perhaps science will one day declare that the backwards cultures and retarded peoples which constitute so many dead weights and impedimenta on humanity's path must be cleared away. But we are assured that the critical moment of the conscience of M. Colossus, transformed on the spot from a clear conscience into a noble conscience, will arrest the executioner's arm and pronounce the salus sis, to which we are indebted for the following juicy note. For me, the question of equality of races, peoples, or cultures has a meaning only if we are talking about an equality in law, not an equality in fact. In the same way, men who are blind, maimed, sick, feeble-minded, ignorant, or poor, one could hardly be nicer to the non-Occidentals, are not respectively equal, in the material sense of the word, to those who are strong, clear-sighted, whole, healthy, intelligent, cultured, or rich. The latter have greater capacities, which, by the way, do not give them the more rights, but only more duties. Similarly, whether for biological or historical reasons, there exist the present differences in level, power, and value among the various cultures. These differences entail inequality in fact. They in no way justify inequality of rights in favor of the so-called superior peoples, as racism would have it. Rather, they confer upon them additional tasks and increased responsibility. Additional tasks? What are they if not tasks of the ruling world? Increased responsibility? What is it if not responsibility for the world? And Colossus Atlas charitably plants his feet firmly into the dust and once again rises his sturdy shoulders, the inevitable white man's burden. The reader must excuse me for having talked about M. Colossus at such length. It is not that I overestimate to any degree whatever the intrinsic value of his philosophy. The reader will be able to judge how seriously one should take a thinker who, while claiming to be dedicated to rigorous logic, sacrifices so willingly prejudice and wallows so voluptuously in cliches. But his views are worth special attention because they are significant. Significant of what? of the state of mind of thousands upon thousands of Europeans, or to be very precise, the state of mind of the Western petty bourgeoisie. Significant of what? Of this, that at the very time when it is most often in the mouths of the world, the West has never been further being able to live a true humanism, a humanism made to measure of the world. One of the values invented by the bourgeoisie in former times and launched throughout the world was man, and we have seen what that has become of that. The other was the nation. It is a fact, the nation is a bourgeoisie phenomenon. Exactly, but if I turn my attention from man to nations, I note that here too there is great danger, that colonial enterprises is to the modern world what Roman imperialism was to the ancient world, the prelude to disaster and the forerunner of catastrophe. Come now. The Indians massacred, the Muslim world drained of itself, the Chinese world defiled and perverted for a good century, the Negro world disqualified, mighty voices stilled forever, homes scattered to the wind, all this wreckage, all this waste, humanity reduced to a monologue, and you think that this does not have any price? The truth is that this policy cannot bring about the ruin of Europe itself, and that Europe, if it's not careful, will perish from the void that it has created around itself. They thought that they were only slaughtering Indians or Hindus or South Sea Islanders or Africans. They have in fact overthrown, one after the other, the ramparts behind which European civilization could have been developed freely. I know how fallacious historical parallels are, particularly for the ones I am about to draw. Nevertheless, permit me to quote a page from Edgar Quinet, for the not inconsiderable element of truth which it contains, and which is worth pondering. Here it is. People ask why barbarism emerged all at once in ancient civilization. I believe I know the answer. It is surprising that so simple a cause is not obvious to everyone. The system of ancient civilization, which was composed of a certain number of nationalities, of countries which, although they seemed to be enemies, were ignorant of each other, protected, supported, and guarded one another. When expanding the Roman Empire undertook to conquer and destroy these groups of nations, the dazzled sophists thought that they saw an end of this road humanity triumphant in Rome. They talked about the unity of the human spirit. It was only a dream. It happened that these nationalities were so many bulwarks protecting Rome itself. Thus, when Rome in its alleged triumphal march towards a single civilization had destroyed one after the other, Carthage, Egypt, Greece, Judea, Persia, Dacia, and Cisalpine, and Transalpine Gaul, it came to pass that it itself had swallowed up the dikes that had protected it against the human ocean under which it was to perish. The magnanimous Caesar, by crushing the two Gauls, only paved the way for the Teutons. So many societies, so many languages extinguished, so many cities, rights, homes annihilated, created a void around Rome. And in those places which were not invaded by the barbarians, barbarism was born spontaneously. The vanquished Gauls changed into Bogades. Thus the violent downfall, the progressive extirpation of individual cities caused the crumbling of ancient civilization. That social edifice was supported by the various nationalities as by so many different columns of marble or by porphyry. When to the applause of the wise men of the time, each of these living columns had been demolished, the edifice came crashing down, and the wise men of our day are still trying to understand how such mighty ruins could have been made in a moment's time. And now I ask, what else has the bourgeoisie Europe done? It has undermined civilizations, destroyed countries, ruined nationalities, extirpated the root of diversity. No more dikes, no more bulwarks. The hour of the barbarian is at hand. The modern barbarian, the American hour. Violence, excess, waste, mercantilism, bluff, conformism, stupidity, vulgarity, disorder. In 1913, Ambassador Page wrote to Wilson, "The future of the world belongs to us. Now what are we going to do with the leadership of the world presently when it has clearly fallen into our hands?" And in 1914, what are we going to do with this England and this empire presently when economic forces unmistakably put the leadership of the race in our hands? This empire and the others. Indeed, you do not see how ostentatiously these gentlemen have just unfurled the banner of anti-colonialism. Aid to the disinherited countries, says Truman. The time of old colonialism has passed. That's also Truman. Which means that every American high finance considers that the time has come to raid every colony in the world. So, dear friends, here you have to be careful. I know that some of you, disgusted with Europe, with all of that hideous mess which you did not witness by choice, are turning.